One might legitimately ask why it is that we're devoting an entire program to a single individual, Bill Kristol, who has never held elected office in the United States and who has never been in any official positions of power, who essentially has spent his life as a pundit, an operative, and an activist. He has worked very, very closely with numerous politicians who did rise to high levels of political influence, including former Vice President Dan Quayle during the first Bush administration. But in general, Bill Kristol is an operative. He's a propagandist. He's an activist, and he's an influencer. And the reason why he merits so much attention, the attention that we're about to lavish on him, the light we're about to shine on him, is because, credit where it's due, he has been uniquely effective, uniquely consequential in his attempt to mold and shape America and its foreign policy to align with neoconservative ideology. And particularly because so many people have not lived through the events of the early years that brought the Iraq War into play, or who have forgotten what neoconservatives are because they are now largely identified with the cause of sabotaging Donald Trump and endlessly denouncing him. There is a huge amount of amnesia, especially among the liberals in the United States who have come to regard neocons as icons and thought leaders, that it is really urgent to delve deep and document exactly what their driving worldview is. Not back in 2002, but always, including through today, because I do believe it's the case that neocons exert more influence than ever before, including in their heyday of 2002, and thus there are very few groups, if there are any, meriting the kind of critical scrutiny that we're about to devote not just to neocons, but to their unquestioned leader, Bill Kristol, who is now identified as an anti-Trump activist, but who has become overtly a Democratic Party adherent and supporter. He's funded by one of the world's richest men in Pierre Omidyar, who funds numerous Bill Kristol organizations, including the media outlet that he now edits and runs, The Bulwark, which is read by many people. And most importantly of all, the ability of Bill Kristol and his neocon comrades to maintain influence within liberal establishment institutions and within the dominant Democratic Party means that foreign policy increasingly has become a mirror image of what Bill Kristol and neoconservatives always wanted it to be. And that's the reason why it's so important to spend time documenting both their history and their current ideology. So let's start with a 1998 article that was published in the New York Times. It was co-authored by Bill Kristol and by Robert Kagan. And if that last name, Kagan, sounds familiar to you, it should. Robert Kagan is the husband of Victoria Nuland, who at the time in 1998 was a Clinton administration official. She then went on to become Dick Cheney's chief foreign policy advisor for the Iraq War. She then rose even further within the next administration, the Obama administration, where she essentially began running Ukraine, first for Hillary Clinton's State Department and then for John Kerry's. The only time we got her out of government was during the 4 years of the Trump administration, and now she's back in the Biden administration running Ukraine and the war in Ukraine from a neoconservative perspective for the Biden administration. So it was Bill Kristol and her husband, Robert Kagan, whose brother, Frederick Kagan, is also a leading neocon, and his wife, Frederick Kagan's wife, Kimberly Kagan, was the theorist behind the so-called surge that was designed to keep Americans hooked on and continuing to support the war in Iraq in 2006 and 2007. It's really like a neoconservative dynasty, like the Kennedy family of neoconservatism. So here you have Bill Kristol and Robert Kagan in 1998. At the time, Bill Clinton started bombing Iraq. And the claim from a lot of conservatives was he's only doing this to distract from the scandal that eventually resulted in his impeachment through the Monica Lewinsky scandal. And yet Bill Kristol and Robert Kagan were not condemning Bill Kristol for bombing Iraq. They, in fact, were arguing that it was nowhere near enough in terms of the military force that we had to bring to bear. Now, remember, the Iraq War ended up happening 5 years after this article was published, 5.5 years, in part because of 9/11 providing the pretext. But neoconservatives were demanding this long before. Here's what the New York Times article read. The headline there, you see it, bombing Iraq isn't enough. And it then reads, Saddam Hussein must go. Saddam Hussein must go. The imperative may seem too simple for some experts and too daunting for the Clinton administration. But if the United States is committed, as the president said in his State of the Union message, to ensuring that the Iraqi leader never again uses weapons of mass destruction, the only way to achieve that goal is to remove Mr. Hussein and his regime from power. Any policy short of that will fail. Does the United States really have to bear this burden? Yes. Unless we act, Saddam Hussein will prevail, the Middle East will be destabilized, other aggressors around the world will follow his example, and American soldiers will have to pay a far heavier price when the international peace sustained by American leadership begins to collapse. If Mr. Clinton is serious about protecting us and our allies from Iraqi biological and chemical weapons, he will order ground forces to the Gulf. 4 heavy divisions and 2 airborne divisions are available for deployment. The president should act and Congress should support him in the only policy that can succeed. So long before 9/11, in 1998, they were demanding a massive, gigantic deployment of U.S. military force into the Middle East to invade Iraq and to change the government. By itself, that is as extreme and deranged a policy as anyone could possibly advocate. And the arguments they made for it, that Iraq had WMDs and that it was Saddam Hussein who was destabilizing the region and would continue to do so unless you removed him, by itself should have forever removed them from any kind of access to institutions of influence. After all, we know, of course, that that entire article was premised on a lie, and nothing destabilized the Middle East, nothing, more than the invasion of Iraq and the removal of Saddam Hussein. Even Tony Blair admits, despite continuing to be an advocate of that war, and who presided as Prime Minister of the United Kingdom when the UK joined the US in invading, that it was exactly that war and the removal of Saddam Hussein that gave rise to ISIS. So how can someone be an advocate of clearly the worst, most destructive, and most immoral foreign policy of the last 25 years, the war in Iraq, have spent years advocating it based on lies, based on arguments that turned out to be the opposite of truth, and not have any career harm at all? In fact, continuing to thrive. Thriving more than ever. Access to every single establishment platform. Because it doesn't matter how much you lie. It doesn't matter how sociopathic the policies are you advocate. As long as you're doing so on behalf of the U.S. security state, your career will thrive. And nobody demonstrates that more than Bill Kristol. Now, the neoconservative entity they created was called the Project for a New American Century. It was really an organization designed to encapsulate and implement the neoconservative worldview. Here they are in a letter from that organization to President Clinton regarding Iraq on January 26, 1998, where they basically wrote to President Clinton demanding that he invade Iraq. Quote, "We are writing you because we are concerned that current American policy toward Iraq is not succeeding and that we may soon face a threat in the Middle East more serious than any we have known since the end of the Cold War. In your upcoming State of the Union address, you have an opportunity to chart a clear and determined course for meeting that threat. We urge you to seize that opportunity and to enunciate a new strategy that would secure the interests of the U.S. and our friends and allies around the world. That strategy should aim, above all, at the removal of Saddam Hussein's regime from power. We stand ready to offer our full support in this difficult but necessary endeavor." They weren't offering there, by the way, to enlist and go and fight in that war, needless to say. They wanted to send other people's families to go fight and die for this necessary endeavor. Whatever support they were offering would have been from the safe distance in their homes in Northern Virginia. They go on, quote, "The only acceptable strategy is one that eliminates the possibility that Iraq will be able to use or threaten to use weapons of mass destruction. In the near term, this means a willingness to undertake military action as diplomacy is clearly failing. In the long term, it means removing Saddam Hussein and his regime from power. That now needs to become the aim of American foreign policy. We urge you to articulate this aim and to turn your administration's attention to implementing a strategy for removing Saddam's regime from power. This will require a full complement of diplomatic, political, and military efforts. Although we are fully aware of the dangers and difficulties in implementing this policy, dangers they had no indication or no willingness or interest in getting near, but they did acknowledge they were aware of these dangers. Quote, we believe the dangers of failing to do so are far greater. We believe the U.S. has the authority under existing U.S. resolutions to take the necessary steps, including military steps, to protect our vital interests in the Gulf. In any case, American policy cannot continue to be crippled by a misguided insistence on unanimity in the UN Security Council. We urge you to act decisively. If you act now to end the threat of weapons of mass destruction against the U.S. or its allies, you will be acting in the most fundamental national security interests of the country. If we accept the course of weakness and drift, we put our own interest and our future at risk. So these really were the leading theorists and advocates of what became the most shameful, the most destructive, and the most immoral war of the last 40 or 50 years. How is it that it did not destroy their careers reading this? Quite the contrary. Bill Kristol has become an icon of Democratic Party politics and American liberal politics. He is a star in social media, almost entirely driven by the admiration of liberals. He only became that when he took a leading role in denouncing Donald Trump, and then immediately saw how he could integrate himself into the Democratic Party, insinuate himself into its politics, and import this ideology back into the party that is now dominant in the United States. When the run-up to the Iraq War happened, after 9/11 took place, these same neocons saw their opportunity. They saw that they could get the United States to invade not just Iraq, but a series of countries, and began beating the drums as hard as possible. And I want to make the point here, there are obviously a lot of people who are now very popular in liberal politics who played a major role in bringing about the Iraq War. First among them, Joe Biden, probably the senator most responsible for getting the United States Senate to pass the authorization to use military force. He was chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee, along with Hillary Clinton, and John Kerry became an outspoken defender of the need to remove Saddam Hussein. People like David Frum, the beloved Atlantic writer who's constantly on CNN and MSNBC, cheered by liberals for everything he does as an ardent defender of American democracy. Through his denunciations of Trump, wrote the speeches that came out of George Bush's mouth that misled the country into that war. But Bill Kristol was the leading theorist, constantly pounding this drum for years. And here he is in the beginning of 2002, so just a couple of months after September 11th, immediately trying to exploit the emotions that honest Americans felt to direct them to a war that he had long wanted for whatever his motives were. And the article was entitled, What to Do About Iraq, and I'm showing you this not because it's some singular or aberrational example, but because it's completely illustrative of the lies and deceit and propaganda they were constantly feeding into the American discourse. Quote, the amazing thing about the current, quote, debate over Iraq is that no one disputes the nature of the threat. Everyone agrees that, as Al Gore's former national security advisor Leon Forth puts it, quote, Saddam Hussein is dangerous and likely to become more so, that he is, quote, a permanent menace to the region and to the vital interests of the United States. No one questions, furthermore, the basic facts about Saddam Hussein's weapons program. Do you see they're saying nobody disputes the fact that Saddam Hussein has a nuclear weapons program? Nobody disputes that he has biological and chemical weapons. All of these are lies, of course. Not only did they have no such program, but there were many people disputing it. And then here he says, nor is there any doubt that after September 11th, Saddam's weapons of mass destruction pose a kind of danger to us that we hadn't fully grasped before. Do you see the way they're just exploiting the emotions of Americans after 9/11, pretending that 9/11 is the proof that we have to get rid of Saddam Hussein, constantly planting these seeds that 70% of Americans ended up believing that Saddam was responsible for the planning of the 9/11 attack, when in reality this is something that they wanted well before 9/11, as we just showed you. In the 1990s, much of the complacency about Saddam, both in Washington and in Europe, rested on the assumption that he could be deterred. Saddam was not a madman, the theory went, and would not commit suicide by actually using the weapons he was so desperately trying to obtain. Some of us, it's true, had our doubts about this logic. The issue seemed to us not so much whether we could deter Saddam, but whether he could deter us. If Saddam had had nuclear weapons in 1991, would we have gone to war to drive him from Kuwait? But after September 11th, and by the way, there you see an important premise that had long been permeating American foreign policy, that when a country has nuclear weapons, it is madness in the extreme to risk a war with that country. A precept that has completely disappeared as neocons like Bill Kristol continue to demand that the United States escalate more and more the proxy war in Ukraine. Now here he is again exploiting the trauma that Americans felt from September 11th. Quote, after September 11th, we have been all but forced to consider another scenario. What if Saddam provides some of his anthrax or his VX or a nuclear device to a terrorist group like Al-Qaeda? Saddam could help a terrorist inflict a horrific attack on the United States or its allies while hoping to shroud his role in the secrecy of cutouts and middlemen. How in the world do we deter that? To this day, we don't know who provided the anthrax for the post-September 11th attacks. You may recall that we did a show a month ago where we walked through the critical nature that the anthrax attacks played in bringing about the war in Iraq because of liars and propagandists like Bill Kristol linking continuously the anthrax attacks to Saddam Hussein, and more nefariously, constantly trying to link Saddam Hussein to the planning of the 9/11 attacks. We constantly hear about the evils of disinformation, and yet right before your eyes, you're seeing that there is no more pernicious disinformation agent than Bill Kristol, Robert Kagan, and his neocons, and they have more blood on their hands over it than anybody else. Here he goes on about the anthrax attacks. We may never know for sure, although we hear only about the risk of such actions, the benefits could be very substantial. A devastating knockout blow against Saddam Hussein, followed by an American-sponsored effort to rebuild Iraq and put it on a path toward democratic governance, would have a seismic impact on the Arab world, for the better. The Arab world may take a long time coming to terms with the West, but that process will be hastened by the defeat of the leading anti-Western Arab tyrant. None of that happened, of course. It is past time for the United States to step up and accept the real responsibilities and requirements of global leadership. We've already tried the alternative. During the 1990s, those who argued for limiting American involvement overseas, for avoiding the use of ground troops, for using force in a limited way and only as a last resort, for steering clear of nation building, for exit strategies and burden sharing, those who prided themselves on their prudence and realism won the day. A few missile strikes here and there, a few sting operations, but when confronted with the choice of using serious force against Al-Qaeda or really helping the Iraqi opposition moving to drive Saddam Hussein from power, President Clinton and his top advisors flinched. They always depict a reluctance to go to war as a sign of cowardice, and conversely, an eagerness to send other people's kids to go to war as a sign of courage. If Bill Kristol were suiting up to go fight these wars that he was constantly advocating, maybe he would be justified in depicting himself as courageous. But there's nothing courageous about writing articles in the Weekly Standard, trying to manipulate the American public and play on their emotions to start wars that other people go and fight for your own hidden agenda. But this is the standard that remains today. That if you are unwilling to send America to another war, if you're against it, it means you're a coward, you're not willing to fight for freedom. You're Neville Chamberlain to the Churchillian warriors like Bill Kristol, who constantly demand that America fights one war after the next. He goes on, most Republicans put little sustained pressure on the Clinton administration to act otherwise. The necessary actions were all deemed too risky. The administration, supported by most of the foreign policy establishment, took the, quote, prudent course. Only now do we know that it was an imprudent course. The failure of the United States to take risks and to take responsibility in the 1990s paved the way to September 11th. again implying that our refusal or our failure to remove Saddam Hussein in the 1990s somehow is what caused September 11th. Now, again, I'm emphasizing this not as a relic of history, although that would be important, to remember who it is who has the blood on their hands from all these wars, but because this exact mindset that the United States has to be the world leader, and the way we're the world leader is by constantly going to wars in every part of the world to put governments in power that we want and to remove governments that we dislike, continues to be the dominant ideology in Washington that drives American foreign policy from Syria to Libya to Afghanistan and now in Ukraine. And the same exact people who were spreading these lies back then in this demented mindset are the same people now doing so. The only thing that changed is back then they were doing it on behalf of the Republican Party, and now they do it on behalf of the Democratic Party. Thanks for watching this clip from System Update. Catch our full shows for free, live weekdays at 7 p.m. Eastern on Rumble, and join our locals community at greenwald.locals.com for all of my written journalism, exclusive after-show Q&As, and more.